So welcome and thank you for watching. This is the London System versus Laura 1100, game 1, as we are making our way through the chess.com intermediate bots. And let me re-emphasize that if you're not familiar with the opening moves of the London, right below here we have our template that we use to guide us in our moves and the setup of the London System. But also, if you are not familiar with these moves as I begin this game, or you're not familiar with the attacking lines, please refer to some of the earlier videos, especially those with the beginner bots, where I go into much more detail about the opening moves, the lines of attack. As we progress through the intermediate bots, the opening lines, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that. I assume we all already know those. So with that in mind, let's begin. d4, knight f6, bishop f4, e6, knight f3, and c5. Let me pause here just for a moment. These moves of e6, knight to f6, and c5 are going to become kind of standard in the defense as we move through the intermediate bots in defending against the London. These are kind of the traditional moves in playing the London, especially this c5 move targeting the d4 pawn. And we kind of come to a junction here at the very beginning with this c5 move of anticipating how are we going to best defend the d4 pawn. And I will say we do obviously have this knight at f3 that can defend, but with regard to two pawn moves in particular, e3 and c3, both of these are valid moves as our next move. My preference is e3. The reason for that is I have experienced in some other games at this point moving e3 and then having the c5 pawn take at d4 and then me having to take back with the e pawn. If that scenario were to happen with the c3 pawn, and I have experienced that, so we have take and take back, it leaves this diagonal toward the king for both the queen and the dark square bishop to come down and attack. Now, we still would have the b knight coming to d2. However, now at least temporarily, that knight at d2 is frozen to protect, we'll say, from an attack from the queen. And then what black usually does is follow up with a move right here, bringing this knight to e4, and we cannot attack here because we have to remain in place to defend the king. So this is why, based on experience right now, where I'm at in my learning, I have opted to go with e3 as the next move in defense, and that is our move. e3, knight c6, again, a typical defensive move against the London by black. Now we'll come up with c3 because once again we already have the e3 pawn in place. And d5. Now we'll move our b knight to d2, bishop d6, and we have our first confrontation here between the dark square bishops. Once again, two primary choices here for us is we take, and then usually the queen will come up and take at d6, or we will pull back to g3, and should this, let me highlight this, and should this dark square bishop take, we will take with the pawn at h2, thereby opening up this h-file for control by our rook. So I chose to move back to g3, and black castles. We now move with our last move of the setup of the London of bishop to d3, and Laura responds with b6. And at this point in the game, we're transitioning from the opening to the middle game. As I said in most of the other videos we've done together, it's a good time to pause, review our attacking lines of the light square bishop along these two diagonals, the queen along these light square diagonals. Also, we have the knight at f3 to e5, a common move within the London. We still have the dark square diagonal if we choose to take. And of course, usually the queen comes up to take. One of the reasons why I refrain from doing this is because I never want to give my opponent an excuse to bring the most powerful piece forward into the action. And that's why I usually refrain from taking that dark square bishop there at d6. We can also castle if we want to. Now that the black has castled with the king here at g8, we can begin to advance at some point these pawns along the G and H file. We can also, as we've done in the past, bring our A rook over to C1 and maybe begin to target this area here in which we bring a pawn forward and attack the middle and try to gain some control there with the rook on the C file. So all of these are options that we've been over several times in previous videos about the attacking lines of the London. But in this particular game, I chose to kind of slow walk this, and I wanted to target the two pawns here in the middle on the D and E files. And so I just simply decided to engage with a pawn. I'm always much more willing to engage with pieces that are expendable or more expendable, talking about pawns, as opposed to possibly going ahead and engaging here with the knight to e5 and setting up some kind of, trade scenario. I'm really not ready to do that. So, and again, in the intermediate game, as we begin that transition, sometimes you're just sending out probes. You're just trying to find out how the enemy is going to respond and what seems to work out for your favor. Again, at our level around 1100, we're still working with the trial and error. And that's part of the process, and that's okay. So we'll move forward with e4. Black responds with moving the bishop back to e7. So now we have a choice before us as well. Do we take the d5 pawn, or do we move forward here and target the knight? If we do that, more than likely, it's been my experience that the knight will move over here to h5, targeting the bishop. So I elected in this game to move forward to kind of secure this line of pawns here, good defense, a little picket fence, so to speak. And sure enough, black responds by moving the knight to h5. And so once again, if the knight chooses to take the bishop, we will take with the h2 pawn, again, thereby opening up the H file for our rook. So as I surveyed the chessboard at this time, again, nothing really looked inviting for promotion of any of the minor pieces. So I again began to look at pushing some of the pawns forward, and I kind of wanted to target this c5 pawn, and certainly by doing that move my b pawn up to d4. However, I don't want to do that first off. The reason for that is if I move the pawn to b4 and this pawn takes, I will need to take back with the c3 pawn, and by doing so I lose protection for my d4 pawn here, and I did not want to do that. So I'm going to kind of lay a foundation. The goal here is to move to a3 as support, and then b4. So that's what I began doing, so that you understand my thinking behind this. A3, but obviously Black, seeing that and the possibility of it, decided to move forward with the C pawn to C4, targeting the bishop. But again, we have an easy resolve to that, and it is to move the bishop back to C2. Black responds with rook to B8. I decided just to go ahead and castle. We have bishop A6. Now, please note the target isn't necessarily to protect this, but ultimately to get to the rook at F1. So again, easy resolve to this is just move the rook to E1, and thereby we can try to begin to exert some control along this E file. Black responds by moving the queen to E8. I answer by moving the knight to F1, wanting to lend support to the bishop at G3, just in case there is an attack. Here, I want to try and maintain this pawn structure in front of the king for as long as I can into the game. So Black responds with bishop to D8, and now I am ready to engage in conflict with the opposition. So I'm going to move my dark square bishop to H4, inviting an exchange here. I will take back with the knight at F3, but the primary goal of this exchange isn't just to exchange bishops, it's to open up this diagonal to attack this knight here. And that's what I am trying to accomplish. So we move there, and Black responds by moving the rook back to A8. So since there is not going to be an exchange of the bishops at this point, I began looking at the possibility of bringing this knight up to G5. It would open up the diagonal of attack for the queen to the knight at H5, but even more so than that, this knight at G5 would be in position to be able to attack the H7 pawn, protected with the light square bishop at C2, and then putting my queen possibly right here, and you can see that checkmate would be very simple at this point. So I chose to do that, move the knight to G5, and of course a move is needed by Black at this point, so he comes up to take the knight, and at that point it gives me the opportunity to go ahead and take this knight. So we basically have had an exchange of knights, and then if this bishop takes here, I'll just take back with the queen. That's not an issue. But Black chose to move forward with the f-pawn from f7 to f5, and by doing so left this bishop unguarded, so we will take with the queen. Black responds with queen to d7, and I need to begin to mobilize some of my pieces to bring further support for this attack. So knight to e3, pawn comes up to g6, and now that opens up a line of attack for the queen simply to come here, have the influence along this dark square, and now it's also opened up the venue for the diagonal, dark square diagonal with the dark square bishop here. So we are in a very good position to continue our attack. So we have pawn to f4. We'll simply move our knight to a safe square at g4. The king moves to h8, and hopefully you can see the possibility of just bringing our dark square bishop here, put the king in check. If the rook comes up to take, we can take back with the knight, and we'll immediately, if you can see this, we'll immediately put pressure upon the queen that way, if that's the route we go. So let's bring the dark square bishop to f6, check. Black responds with the king moving to g8. So again, a little flurry of activity, and let's just simply review where we're at. We have tremendous support here, getting ready to surround the king with this pawn, the bishop, the knight, and the queen here. So those pieces are in position and placed. Don't see any need to move those at this time. And now it is up to some of the other support pieces that we have, the two rooks and this light square bishop here, to continue on with the attack. And the one thing that caught my eye is just to come with the light square bishop and take the pawn at g6 and just sacrifice it. Maybe this pawn comes up, maybe the queen comes over. I'm not sure what the response would be, but we need to eliminate this pawn structure here at g6 and h7 in order to make it a little bit easier to get through to the king. So that's what I chose to do. Black responds probably with not a great move, moving the rook over to b8. So now we need to assess where we're at and what is the best way to go forward. Let me talk about a couple of things that we probably would not do. Bring the queen here to g7. It'd probably be taken by the queen. We take back, the king takes back. Not a great scenario. Same thing here. If the queen goes down to take the pawn at h7, queen comes over, take, and the king comes up to take. Again, not a great scenario. So the venue that I chose is to reposition two pieces, to move this dark square bishop back to g8 and move this knight into the f6 position, giving me a fork here upon the queen and the king, if it turns out to be that way. So that's the avenue that I took. We'll bring the bishop back to g5, and black responds by getting the queen out of the fork, but staying along the 7th rank to protect all of these positions here. I will still go ahead and move my knight into position at f6 because it is a wonderful position. It puts the king in check, and now the king really has one square to go to, and that is h8 once again. So the avenue forward from here that seemed to be best to me at the time was to just take this pawn at h7 with the knight, and if the queen is to come over and take, we can just simply take. It'll be the game over. So that's what I chose to do. But black did not take the knight, but rather came to the g7 square, probably kind of wanting to engage, some kind of exchange here with the queens. But there is another line of attack that we could take, and that is simply, hopefully you see this, is to move the dark square bishop here to f6 and pin the queen to the king. So that's what I chose to do. Black responds with bringing some support here from the rook to b7, so that if we start having an exchange here, it will have support. And we have an opportunity to take the queen, so let's do that with the bishop. Take, rook comes over to take, and now we cannot just directly take here with the queen, for we would lose our queen. So we have to find another way in which to continue the attack. And the simplest one that I saw at the time was just to take this knight and move back to f6, and the king will automatically be in check. The king will either have to move or the rook comes over to block. We'll see what happens. The rook comes over to block, and of course, hopefully you see this. We just move forward with the queen take, and that is the end of the game. So I hope you enjoyed this game. I would encourage you to once again review this game, review some of the details that I went through on not only the setup, but also the lines of attack. Again, play your own games and then analyze your own games. This is the way you grow. If you make some mistakes with these bots, it's really not a problem. You learn from those mistakes, start another game, and as I've said several times in this series, rinse and repeat. So I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors to grow. We started with Jimmy 600, and we're now at the 1100 level in the chess.com ratings. And we will continue in the next video with Laura 1100 Game 2. Again, thank you for watching.